We're calling to order the June 4th meeting of the Salem Revenue Task Force. First thing off the line here is welcome and introductions, which generally means that I read the roll call. So we'll start with Becky Beeman. Here. Russ Beaton. Here. Scott Cantamoy. Here. Katie Ciante. Here. Ken Collins. Here. Beth Vargas Duncan. Matthew Hale. Here. Levi Herrera Lopez. Here. Stephen Jenkins. Here. Kathy Knock.
Here.
Ariel Leval.
Here.
Lee McKenzie.
Here.
Raquel Moore Green.
Here.
Sean Nick is present. Keith Norris. Jean Palmater.
Here.
Ray Quisenberry.
Here.
Nate Rafin.
Here.
David Reinhold.
Here.
Bill Rickey.
Here.
Gretchen Schilly.
Here.
Caitlin Strafty.
Here.
Bill Smalden.
Here.
TJ Sullivan.
Here.
And Kathy Van Eck Fort.
Here.
All right. Next comes is public comments, but I believe we have no public comments tonight. Is that correct? No public comments. Okay. So then next up, we have the approval of the May 21st, 2024 meeting minutes. Any comments on the minutes? Has everyone had a chance? Becky?
I'd like to change.
Becky, can you turn your mic on, please?
Becky Beeman. I'd like to change an item on page 4 of the minutes. It's the third item down, discussion, the third bullet. I'd like to replace that bullet with the following. Russ also shared a model of hypothetical revenue based on an average of tax bracket rates recommended by Chamber of Commerce members who are also on the Revenue Task Force. This model predicted $41 million in potential revenue.
Any discussion of the potential change? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone who wishes to say nay? The ayes have it. Are there any other changes to the meeting minutes? I have a change for the meeting minutes. It would be on page 4, under mid-interest revenue, option survey results, motion. Task force unanimously voted to remove, not to move. That would be my change. Is anyone, any discussion on that change? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Is there any further discussion about any items on the meeting minutes? All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. The meeting minutes are approved. Next up, we have the council recommendations for packet structure review.
All right, there we go. Good evening, everyone. We always like to start you off with the meeting minutes so you get really excited about making motions. So here we are. We're going to work on the council recommendation packet tonight, and we'll deliberate on our remaining revenue options, hopefully narrow it down to what we want to talk about next week for the final recommendation packet. So we'll go through what the elements of that will be, talk a little bit about that, answer your questions tonight. Here's our timeline. We're almost done. There may or may not be cake at the next meeting. We're going to work on our recommendations today. We're going to finalize them next week. That's all we got. Any questions about where we are in the process? At this point, you've seen this slide a lot, so we should be comfortable with it. Okay. So, this should say July 15th, council meeting. So per the task force charter, we will be presenting on July 15th to council. The chair and vice chair of the task force will present the recommendations. We'll also be presenting some of that contextual information. So the results that we got from the survey, information from the communications team will be presented so that council has a full picture of the process and things to consider as they go through deliberations deliberating on these options. We anticipate that council will discuss options and identify what they might want to explore further. And so that might require some additional work, probably from staff or consultants. So that could be things like modeling out specific options based on certain criteria. It could mean additional polling by DHM. It could be additional community engagement, things like that. We anticipate that that work will happen over the course of the next couple of months as they are deliberating the options, but we don't anticipate that they will necessarily reconvene the task force. But that's up to council, so we'll see. So the purpose of this is to get to feasible revenue options. What we want in the packet are a set of options grouped in that near, medium, and long term, like you have seen as we've gone through this process. And also, if we want to prioritize services, that has been a discussion topic quite a bit in our meetings, what services to prioritize if the council wanted to restrict funding options. So there have been some discussions about dedicated funding sources, or if we are going out for, a certain type of revenue, what to communicate to the community. That's part of the recommendation packet. And then the additional information would be those revenue pathways and then the community feedback that we've received. Council has seen all the community feedback so far in kind of bits and pieces as we've gone along, but having everything together will provide them with the full story. So it'll probably look something like this. We'll have the revenue option. We'll describe what it looks like, information that you all have seen, how well it aligns with that criteria that we've established, alignment with what we learned from the statistically valid community survey, and then any of those key considerations that we come up with in this group, this meeting, and the next one. So that could be things that we've talked about, like considering equity in implementation, considering what the timeline is, considering what services these could directly support, anything that council would need to know if they are going to adopt this revenue source. So we'll be asking you that tonight about all of these options as we go through. Any questions about that? Yeah, Raquel.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. I'm just curious as to how that fits into the revenue targets that were presented back in February, because we've not talked much about those targets. We've talked a lot about, revenue, but not what those targets are. So how will that fit into that chart, so to speak?
That's a great question. So ultimately, the amount of revenue raised is in council's purview. And so what we have done is identified the pathways, given you all information on the pathways and what potential amount of revenue could be raised. And that's also what we did with the community. But it will be up to council exactly how much they want to raise. The task force can make a recommendation saying we want you to hit, this amount. We think that's the right approach. But really, it's going to be up to them to figure out what hole they want to fill.
And just to add on to that as well, one of the things that we assume based on the last slide would go into the packet would be a description of, if these are the revenue options that this group is recommending, here's which pathways they would support. So that would also be contextual information that we would bring to council as part of the recommendation packet.
Follow up? Thank you. So then we as a group have to decide on which of the revenue targets.
The group will just decide on which revenue options you want to recommend, and then we'll be able to match those up to say, if you implemented, for example, all of the revenue options, they would allow you to hit this or that pathway.
Yeah, Levy.
Yeah, Levy Herrera Lopez. So in terms of alignment with community survey results, will the council be made aware that there was only like a 2% participation rate of Spanish speakers?
Yeah, that's in the results. So they absolutely will be made aware. Yeah, I think it was about, 3% that were actually took it in Spanish? Yeah.
Just for clarification, I know that if it's in the packet, it could get lost, but I think it's really important given the small percentage. that they need to be aware of that fact?
I believe the plan is to have the survey, is that right, Annie Rose? John will be there to present to them. And so that's not necessarily the total population of Spanish speakers. That was the people who opted to take the survey in Spanish. But that doesn't, we don't know exactly what the proportion is. So we do know that the survey was delivered in alignment with the demographics of Salem across all the demographics that we know about. But what we don't know is of the Latino community in Salem, how many would have preferred to take it in Spanish but took it in English.
Last thing, if you just look at demographic data, the percentage of monolingual Spanish speakers in Salem is way above 2%. So if it's statistically representative, it should have been closer to whatever that census number is. So my assumption is it would have been closer to 10% or more, but I'm not an expert. I'm just remembering the data. So for me, that's a really important thing for them to know, because it means that at least there's a little bit more outreach that should be done after.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I will take that as a note and communicate that back to John for his presentation. That's a good point. Yeah.
Bill, Ricky, Levi, I would suggest that when we put our recommendation together, we can note at the bottom, right? So the city sees that in black and white in our presentation that we as a task force are putting together. I don't see why we can't do that. I remind all of us again, probably broken, this is our task force. And what we present is what we present as a group.
Great point. Okay, Annie Rose, over to you.
Great. So the last thing that we wanted to do in this section on the next slide, we want to talk about the actual development process. So per the charter, as it was outlined, Moss Adams and staff team will be putting together a draft of the recommendation. So we'll format it in the way that we just discussed in terms of the information that would go into it and any key considerations that are shared tonight. And then our thought is that we know that this is very important to have your eyes on this, as it is your recommendations. And so we would share that via survey for additional input outside of this meeting for any other considerations that the group may want to vote on, and then bring back a summary of that information to the June 26th meeting for final review, revision, and then adoption by this group. So that's the way that we're planning to move that work forward, to make sure that even if we don't get time to talk through all the key considerations tonight, that will give you another opportunity, and then it can be reviewed and finalized on the 26th. Questions? I think Raquel and then Becky.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. So just clarification of via survey, that means the vehicle in which you're sending it to us, so we see the whole report, it's not the vehicle in which we comment on it, is that correct?
So we'll send you the draft of what would go into that report, and we'll ask for feedback through a survey. So that will be the method that we're requesting the feedback from you all at that time.
Becky Beeman, along the line with Bill's comment, can you give us a key points format slide so that things like we think there was a distressingly low response from the Hispanic community, and we have very conflicting guidance from this where we want to make the business pay but not impact the business climate. I think there's some places where we need to capture, I mean, it's kind of obvious if you dig at the data, but they may not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what we're thinking for each of those options, is we'll be able to give them the general background information about the option itself, but then these key considerations that this group will hopefully be discussing and voting upon tonight in terms of what would need to go to council.
Becky, are you asking for overall, sort of overall
Yes,
considerations?
not related to a
Got it,
specific.
got it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think I saw, oh, sorry.
Scott Cantonwine. I have a question with respect to the creation of the packet. If there is specific feedback that a task force member or a group of members wants to see reflected in that document, can you walk me through the process of how that will be reconciled?
Yeah, it'll be just through this process. So we'll have a section in the survey of saying, are there other things that we need to include? What might that look like? So that will be the opportunity there, as well as obviously anything that is brought up and discussed this evening. And then Bill?
Bill Smaldone. Yeah, that was really my concern. There are some items in the information that will be presented to the council that I, and I think some others, might want to raise regarding some of the methodology that was pursued when asking the public questions at the various forums, for example. One that comes to mind right away is the lumping together on the chart of the payroll tax and the income tax. I mean, anybody who sees anything next to the payroll tax following the last referendum knows that immediately casts a negative shadow, right, on that item. So those are some things that I think might be worth mentioning somewhere in here, and I hope that can be taken into consideration.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that would be part of the general description, too, of the community feedback and how the different methods differed as well, because I remember that point coming up, that was something that came up in the town halls, but that's not how that information was presented on the survey. So we could absolutely have some of those clarification points, too. That's great. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, then I think we can move forward into what we all actually want to be here for, which is the deliberation on revenue options. On the next slide, we had planned to go through and discuss the near term, the medium term, and the long term this evening per your request from the last meeting. So that's what we'll do. But before we head into that, this is the results of the survey that was taken between the last meeting and this meeting. So 17 of you took this survey. Thank you so much for those who participated. I know it's a little difficult to read up there on the screen, but I think the highlight there is that the vast majority of the revenue options that are under consideration received over 50% saying, yes, we want to continue pursuing this option. There are a few that received lower numbers, about 5 there. So we'll be able to address those as we go through and review each of the groupings. But it was nice to see that there's a lot of alignment, at least in terms of who took the survey, showing up in these results as well. So we will come to these in a moment, but just wanted to do the overview of those survey results for you there. And then, unless anyone has any questions about the survey itself, I think we can move to the next slide. Colleen, want to walk us through the near-term options?
Yes, very much. So here are our near-term options. You all have it in your packet in front of you, which I hope is a little bit more accessible because there's a lot of information on this slide. So we have 7 options here. Most of them are fees, and we've got them in this matrix against your decision criteria as well as against that community survey feedback. So our first question here is, are there any that we want to remove? Are there any that we just don't want to go forward with based on the survey that we took? So there are 4 of these in the middle. New fees for services, operations fee increase, parking tax, and TOT increase that you all said we could live without this. These are basically the bottom of the survey results from your survey. And those also, many of them, the community survey feedback was not as high. Yeah, Scott.
Scott Cantonwine. I would move that we strike lines 20, parking tax increase, and line 39, transient occupancy tax increase.
We have a
Who was the
motion and
second
a
there? Sorry. TJ, thank you.
To remove line 20, parking tax increases, and line 39, or number 39, transient occupancy tax increases. Any discussion on this? Okay, hearing none. I expected some, but okay. All in favor of removing those 2, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. The ayes have it.
That was efficient. All right. Anyone want to move to Becky?
Becky Beeman. Since the franchise fee increase would likely be implemented through an operations fee, those are kind of the same thing. And since we have an operations fee that kind of affects everybody, I would recommend we keep that one, but I'd like us to get rid of one or the other. So for the sake of putting a motion forward, I'll say I'd like to remove item 10 and keep 19.
I believe the CFO has some input.
Good evening, Josh Eggleston, Chief Financial Officer. Franchise fees are quite a bit different than a city operations fee. The city operations fee is on your utility bill. A franchise fee is actually levied on utility providers. So, for example, the two that would be left are solid waste or our city-operated water, wastewater, stormwater utility. So they are different.
But they'll be passed, Becky again, they'll be passed to the residents the same way through their utility bills or their waste fee bills.
Correct, yes.
It boils down to the same thing.
Raquel, and then Scott.
Thank you. Raquel Moore Green. Josh, for clarification, that franchise fee increase will actually be to, for instance, the utilities who lay the cable, and the utilities will then, if so inclined, will raise the rates on the ratepayers, correct? Yes. And I guess I just want to make and if that's the case, I just want to make a clear distinction that we would see the difference between these is we would see one in a utility bill that comes from a utility provider and a bill that comes from the city, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yes, that's essentially correct. I would point out the solid waste rates are set by the city through a franchise agreement. So we're approving that increase. So if you put a increased franchise fee, the solid waste providers are going to ask for an increase.
Scott, and then Bill.
Scott Cantonwine. Just to bring this point up respectfully, if we're going to use the logic that we're going to disqualify one option because it passes costs on to residents, then at least half of these should be stricken based on that logic.
Bill?
Thank you. Bill Smaldone. So my problem with the utility fee, for example, is that this is the opposite. This kind of a tax is the opposite of what the vast majority of us said we want, okay, which is a more equitable system, right? This is more of the same old regressive stuff that we've been doing for the last 100 years. So it would seem to me, in keeping with our stated goals and with the suggestions that have been made about an overall tax reform, that this should be one of the things that goes, right? That this should be something that we should not consider. And we should tell the city in our recommendations not to consider doing it because it's the opposite of the direction we want it to go.
Becky?
Becky Beeman.
Sean.
We have to do something on this list. Everything on this list is ugly. I'd like to see us change the operations fee and let people opt out of it by showing that they're on SNAP or other ways of showing that they're low income on a case-by-case basis. Levy the charge and tell them, come in, we're going to have somebody at this desk and we will adjudicate your case, bring in your documentation, whatever it is, and get them off the list. But they're all ugly. But what do we do in the near term if we get rid of all the near-term solutions?
Sean, and then let's see, TJ, and then Ray.
It's my understanding that franchise fees can be based on usage for the water, the wastewater, and that sort of thing, whereas operations fees cannot. Is that how that basically works?
Yes, that's correct. It's usually a percent of the cost. So like for a utility bill, it would be a percentage, same for solid waste. So if you have a larger bill for your garbage service, you're going to pay more.
So that being true, I mean, it seems to me that franchise fees can actually be at least somewhat good in that they tax higher users higher. And whereas the operations fee is just a flat fee on everyone's bill. And if you can't make the payment, then kind of too bad for you. But you didn't use any more water or any more wastewater or anything like that. So my argument would be to keep the franchise fees, but get rid of the operations fee.
Wait, we had TJ, we had Ray, and then now I see Matt's hand. TJ, could you turn on your mic? Sorry.
Sorry, TJ Sullivan, first time, long time. I would say that we are looking at short-term revenue options, and we can certainly say that this is not ideal in our belief if we were to move to an income tax. However, I also want to be straight, we keep using the term equitable, and a fee that everyone pays in the city is the most equitable. It may not be the most progressive, but it's the most equitable if everybody is paying it. I just want to make sure we're using the term equitable in the right way.
Ray?
Yeah, Ray Quisenberry. As far as the operations fee, is there a way, and I'll ask the city this, the expert says, is there a way to make that more progressive? Can we adjust that fee depending on some sort of inside the size of the house, let's say, or the square footage of a business or whatever?
There's certainly potential to do something like that. I actually just was at the Sustainable Cities kind of wrap up, and there was a whole class of MPA students that were looking at that specifically, both on the residential and commercial side. So there are ideas out there. Something that City Council is committed to look at is making it a better fee going forward. So it's something we're going to bring to them later this year. It's not simple, so it's billed through our utility billing system, so there are some limitations there. And also, you can't have it be a property tax, so it can't be based on the value of the property.
We have Matt and then Bill.
Yes, Matt Hale. Josh, quick question for you. I recall last year in February there was some discussion at the city level based on the utility billing system that there might be some improvements by about mid this year that might get the raise question a few moments ago. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The city's utility billing system is currently being upgraded to a new system. We are looking at mid this year it going live. It's not live yet. It's hopefully here in the next few months, and that will give us more flexibility. Currently, if you look at your utility bill, the current software, we literally can't add another line. You can't add anything else on that bill. And we've had it for quite a while. So the new system will have much more flexibility.
Matt?
Yes, thanks, Colleen. Matt Hale once again. I'd just like to point out to the task force that if you're a single-family resident, just back of the envelope math, you're paying about almost $200 a year in the city operations fee. So that's a pretty significant bond measure if it was passed by the residents that you're paying permanently, and that the city can change it, due to inflationary measures as well as by a vote of the council. And just in the last 12 months, it's gone up over 70%. So I hear a lot from neighbors and others that I talk to that it's a significant limitation that their water bill now is pretty high. And they ask me, what about this operations fee? What's being funded by it? And I try to explain it to them, but they don't like the answer.
Becky, we started this off with a motion on the floor from you. So
Based on the conversation, I'm perfectly willing to amend my motion to ditch the operations fee and keep the franchise fee in order to have a near-term, as long as we can find a way not to have the franchises pocketing part of the money.
Okay.
Is there a second?
Any further discussion on that?
Is there a second?
Is there a second? Yeah.
Thanks.
We have a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Oh, I've got Ray and Scott. I'm not sure who raised their hand first.
Ray
Sorry.
raised his hand first,
Scott.
so Ray can go first.
Okay, Ray.
Thank you, Ray Quisenberry. I just want to be clear, we're talking about raising the operation fee as opposed to eliminating it. I mean, that's not going to be our recommendation, I don't think, because what the city just said, they're looking at maybe be able to massage it in some ways. Now, we hope that if we can get an income tax, that we could probably look at eliminating it. But for right now, that would be my concern. So,
Scott?
somewhat in line with Ray's comments, I think based on the conversations focusing on progressive application equity, I think it would be prudent for us to maybe make a note in our presentation highlighting those issues. But I think we also maybe need to limit the scope creep a little bit. We are here to make recommendations to the city to raise revenue, not reduce revenue. I think if we're taking things like operations fees completely off the table, we're kind of digging our hole deeper. So I would just caution that maybe we can make those policy statements within the packet, but I'm not sure it's in our best interest to, like I said, dig our current hole deeper.
So would you have either a franchise fee or an operations fee as the name of this option? And let them choose?
I would suggest keeping both on there and letting them choose. I'm not suggesting an either or.
Okay.
Just Ken's next, but I just want to note, Scott, that's a good point. We're starting with the current revenue mix of the city. So we're not starting from zero, right? One of your proposals for long-term tax restructuring does start from zero, and those considerations should absolutely be in there. If we do this, here's what else we would do. But we are starting in an environment where there's already an operations fee and it's a flat fee. So your recommendation could be continue to explore equity in the operations fee. It could also be, we're not recommending any additional operations fees at this time, but we want to say, big picture, equity is important to us, for example, the operations fee. So there are a couple of different ways to weigh in there.
Yes, Zach Ostertag. And one other option too, just that we could consider is somehow chaining changes in the operations fee to some sort of measure like inflation or something like that, which might alleviate some concerns about kind of the predictability of that amount over time for citizens.
Okay, any further discussion on the motion on the floor? Bill?
Well, in response to Zach's comment, to link the operations fee to inflation would be to guarantee that it would go up every year, which is not the case right now. So as much as I would like to see certain kinds of linkages made between inflation and cities' revenues on that item, which is, as I said before, extremely regressive, I don't think that's something we should support.
Any further discussion on this motion?
If I could clarify, the city operations fee, excuse me, does go up every year with inflation. It's tied to the CPIU for the West region with the December to December change. The increase that happened in July was a one-time separate increase, but it does go up for inflation every year. It'll be considered on the fee schedule on June 10th by City Council.
Josh, so it went up 10% when the year we had 10% inflation?
So the CPI we used never saw 10%. I think it was like 6.35, but yes, it did go up.
Okay.
And Ken, you've been waiting patiently to comment.
I'm not sure where you were thinking, but from my perspective, eliminating off of this list the operations fee is not eliminating the operations fee. It's keeping it status quo. It's not somewhere we're looking for additional revenue, but not, as you said, going back of removing that. That's at least my perspective. I don't know where yours. Okay. So.
Thank you for clarifying.
Okay, any further discussion on this motion?
Would you mind just restating the motion before we vote?
All right, the motion is to include the franchise fee increase as one of the ones that we're recommending, and to not include the operations fee increase as one of the tax increases that we're recommending. Did I get that right? Okay. Further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Those came in a few at a time. It sounded like the ayes have it. Do you not feel that way?
Can we do a hand raise
so
for
then
the
the ayes
nays?
have it. The ayes have it.
For the record, I believe we need a hand raise for the nays. Is that correct, Dan? Yes. Okay.
I'm counting 7 nays.
Okay. Thank you. All right, anything else proposed to eliminate from this list?
Yeah, Bill Ricky, I would propose to eliminate business licensing fees.
We have a motion on the floor. Any discussion?
Yeah, so I'm curious about, so maybe somebody on city staff can answer this. How practical is it that this can be done, that the business licensing fee can be done progressively? Because I'm just concerned about, there's a lot of businesses in this community that are struggling, that are just scraping by. There's plenty, and especially startup businesses. A lot of startup businesses don't turn a profit for 5-6 years, easy. So I'm just curious how practical it is that we can make this progressive.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So a business license fee can mean a lot of things, right? There's literally an infinite ways that you could structure it. You could certainly base it off of number of employees. You could base it on small business versus large business. There was an idea actually in the sustainable cities that companies that are headquartered in Salem are at a different rate than those that are headquartered outside of Salem. So that would hit, say, the Walmarts and those kind of stores differently than local businesses. So there's different things you can do, but it really is lots of options for how you can structure it.
Yeah, I guess I have a question. Oh, Becky, you had your hand up first.
Becky Beeman. I don't particularly like this. You've convinced me that there's not much utility and we shouldn't go for much money. However, from a political standpoint, we had a lot of people in the community saying businesses should pay more. And even if we made this a small thing, almost a token fee, it would show that we heard them, but I wouldn't want to tax anybody out of business. And I was frankly looking at this and saying everybody could afford $100 probably, and that would be something.
Yeah, so Bill Ricky, I mean, $100 is something, but what's the point? Does that get us anywhere? Not to be flippant when I say what's the point, but just wondering if is that worth the hassle to employ somebody in the city to manage that, and gather those funds and make sure every business within the city has funded it? Have we netted anything? I guess would be my biggest question. And then for Josh, if we were to tax or have a different fee for Walmart or Lowe's or Home Depot, what would that look like?
It could really look like anything. It would be just how it was structured. So you can see this in several other cities, and I can bring back some examples. But you can have a headquartered in Salem rate, and you can have a rate for those that aren't headquartered in Salem.
Bill?
I'd like to ask the maker of the motion if he might be willing to wait on his motion to take it off the table until we have that information back from the staff.
Yeah, Bill Ricky again. Yeah, Bill, I'm a reasonable guy. I just don't know that we have enough time in terms of meeting length with 2 more to go for the city to get that information back to us. I think it's a darn good point. Maybe some commitment from the city to be able to have some of that data back to us. As an example from where I sit as a small business owner within this community, if you show up to Family Building Blocks or the Boys and Girls Club and all these nonprofits in town, it's the same handful of businesses that are represented there. I don't see the Home Depots. I don't see Lowe's, those types of places, Target, Walmart, things like that. So maybe if you want to have a large business like that in our community, maybe your business license fee in this community is $15,000. They can withstand that a heck of a lot better than a small business could withstand $500, for example. And that gets us at least above the $8,000 starting mark here we had. So I don't know, but that might be something to consider. But yeah, Bill, I'd be willing to pull that off the table if the city thinks they have enough time to get that data put together. I don't know.
I see Matt, Scott, and Sean.
Yes, Matt Hale. To Bill's point, I know that over a year ago, I know and Josh talked about this a few minutes ago, we had this discussion about the operations fee, and a Lowe's or the Costco gets the same charge as I'm sure Bill gets charged on his water bill too, and we were looking at restructuring that. So that's been over 12 months. Yeah, I know we're moving in that direction, so I don't know if we're going to be able to move in that direction, Bill, that you just suggested that quickly. I don't think that will move that fast. So I would say that until we get the operations fee figured out for a Costco and a Lowe's compared to Bill's business, then maybe we come back and revisit the business license fees.
Sean and then Scott?
Okay. I mean, I would also like to see us be specific about a business license fee, I guess is kind of what we're moving towards here. They can certainly be done on a per employee type basis, which would capture larger employers, and would also probably, for something a lot of people might like, is capture large employers of the type that have a large number of employees, which are the type that have a large number of part-time employees. Because that's who really gets the count way up for the number of employers. And doing something like that, I think, would have a lot of support in the community, too. And then perhaps exempting, there's certain types of businesses that are just going to be small by definition because they haven't incorporated in some way. They're not an LLC. They're just a personal business, and we could exempt those in some way. Especially ones like, just small business people running out of their home, doing handcrafts and that kind of stuff. That's not really... to be honest, we won't find them anyway. We don't have a franchise tax board going out and searching for these businesses here in the state of Oregon, so they will simply disappear. But also, I think it's fair not to tax them. Anyway, that's my idea on this, and if we could maybe round that out, or just say something like that and support that type of business fee, would there be support for that?
And just a point of clarification, that's exactly the type of key consideration that you could put into the packet to go along with it. If you said, yes, we want to move forward with this, we don't have all the information, but we know that we want it to be structured in this particular way to get to these ends, that would be a very fair way of presenting that type or any of these options here.
And we could send out some examples of progressive business license fees in the meantime for your consideration. So like Josh said, it can be based on who owns the business, where you're located, number of employees, lots of different ways that you can slice and dice it. We do want to balance how the more complex we make it, the more expensive it will be to administer. So that would also be a consideration then. Scott, your hand was up, and then Kathy and Stephen.
I have nothing to add at this time.
Kathy?
Kathy Knock. I just want to point out the city already charges nominal fees. The marijuana businesses all pay $100. That's all in addition to their taxes. Mobile food units, so we're talking people who probably are owner-based businesses, they're currently required to pay like $100 or $150 every year. So we're already have very small businesses that are required to pay fees. In addition, some of these have to do background checks. So they have all of the administrative issues to go through with that. So we do have the ability to do a nominal fee very easily administratively.
Yeah, Bill Rickey, again, I think, Kathy, the fee that, if you have to do a background check, I would guess that the fee maybe just covers the cost of doing the background check. That makes sense. So we're not really netting anything at the end of the day. And I think you work in that department, right? So those fees, do they net enough to cover your salary, right? So again, I think we're back to the point of, does it make any sense at the end of the day to have a fee like that that's nominal?
I guess my point is we're already in that business. So unless we're going to recommend to council just to get rid of all the business licenses, that, to me, philosophically, there's a reason to have that discussion. Like, you shouldn't have any, or if you're going to do this, it should be something that every business owner is expected. If you have a restaurant even if it's just a counter-based restaurant, you don't have to pay a license fee. But if you have a mobile home food or a mobile food unit, you do. And you have to, so that seems inequitable to me.
Stephen and then Nate.
Thank you, Stephen Jenkins. 2 points. One is I look at the task force decision criteria and the community survey feedback of the near-term options. This is one of the most green and green by the number of green boxes that are on the matrix. So this one that's largely supported based on the community survey feedback, supported by the community, as well as on the task force criteria that we had decided. So that's number one. I think the other piece is we've talked a lot about the progressive piece, and I think there's some options in how we could, the city council could implement this in a progressive way. I think this is a perfect example of the difference between equality and equity, where equality is everybody pays the same amount. I think we've had this conversation here where people feel like that's not the right way. Equitable means you pay an amount that's, based on your impact to the community. And so Costco or a Home Depot or a Lowe's would pay more because they have a larger impact in the community, is where your sole proprietorship, your small LLC would pay less because they have less. And so that is an equitable solution and not necessarily an equal one.
Nate?
Nate Raffin. I apologize to put you on the spot. I have a question. Maybe you can answer it. So my understanding, and I might be wrong, is that currently the businesses that do pay some kind of a license fee to the city of Salem are businesses that do require some special or additional oversight from the city apart from regular other businesses. Am I just generally correct on that?
In general, that could be true, but like the vehicle license fee probably doesn't require that anymore. It used to when we did the drivers, but now it's just the companies. And there are other businesses like restaurants where they do have a regulatory requirement. And one of the problems that we have now is we have staff who walk the streets to find out where those businesses are because we don't know.
Mm-hmm. But restaurants currently don't pay for like a general license fee to the city.
Correct. They don't pay a general license fee to the city.
Street vendors do.
Right, but they have grease traps and there are some solid waste requirements and things that we need to get information from them. And that's kind of on the honor system and finding out.
Okay. So I suppose my concern then is that I think perhaps to justify levying some kind of a general license fee to all businesses, it seems it would be more palatable if it was not just simply to raise revenue. To Becky's point, maybe there's a justification that has to do with first responders, perhaps. I don't know. But I'd be curious, and we don't have to answer this tonight, but perhaps we can answer this by the next meeting. Are there other reasons that we can put forward to justify a general business license apart from just revenue? So just something to think about.
Okay, well, we have a motion on the floor to strike number 4, business taxes. Any further discussion on that?
Yeah. I think, Stephen, to your point about the results from the survey, I think early on, Bill, you brought up the point that, and maybe help me with this a little bit, that question was asked, should businesses pay this fee or more in taxes? And the answer was yes. And the next question was, should you have to pay anything else? And the answer was no as a citizen. And I think Bill brought up the point that the two dots weren't connected, right? Businesses have to pay more, okay? You're gonna pay more. It's just how it's gonna work. They're gonna pass that on. So not that I wanna discredit the survey and what the folks in the community had to say, but I think that perhaps the questions were asked in such a manner that those dots weren't connected by anyone. And we had kind of had that discussion prior that maybe that point was lost somewhere. And maybe this shouldn't be as green as it is in terms of how that question was answered. So I don't know that I give that a whole heck of a lot of weight, given that discussion we had a couple meetings ago.
Okay. Any further discussion? David?
David Reinhold. So I'm one of the few that sit on here representing an organization. I hold the Latino Business Alliance seat, or the Mid-Willamette Valley Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I'm the board president. Talking to several business owners, one of the main concerns that we have with this, it's opening the door to allow something to happen. So today, yeah, $100. 2 years, do we do percentage? Is it 2% like Portland? 2% of a tax on a business is quite a bit. Look at the payroll tax you guys are looking at doing. No one wants to get to 2% of not payroll tax, excuse me. Individual income tax. If you look at the numbers, and so that's one of the biggest fears business owners have in this area, is that this is starting something that will keep raising over a period of time.
Becky?
I think the potential to indicate that all of these short-term options are intended to sunset when the long-term sustainable option is implemented, whichever one that is. I think that's a very reasonable approach to that.
All right, folks, we've had a long discussion on this now, so I'm going to call the question and move it to a vote. All in favor, say aye. Are you guys, we are voting to strike item number 4, business license fees. That's what the vote is for. All in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay.
Nay.
I think we're going to
I
need
would
some
say the
hands raised, but it sounded like the nays.
It sounded like the nays have it, but we can do a division.
Yeah, thank you.
Do the nays first?
Sure.
All right, nays first. Raise your hands, please.
Okay.
Nays first.
what? Nays against it or for it?
Nays are against it.
Nays, keep it on the list.
Keep it on the list.
It's 14. Okay.
And do we need the ayes? Yeah? The count?
I think we're good.
Good, okay.
Yep.
No abstentions?
All right. If there aren't any more motions to remove options, I'd like to go on to discussing the considerations for these. That discussion about business license fees was a great example of the considerations that council needs to know. That's first on our list. Is there anything else we want to say in terms of business license fees? Raquel?
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. To Becky's comment just a moment ago about these sunsetting. So I will raise the concern that if the city does not elect to go after some of the long-term, what we have discussed as maybe permanent, restructuring tax reform, correct? If they decide not to go after that, then they're not going to sunset these, and that's a concern. I just want to raise that because, just thank you.
TJ?
TJ Sullivan, I can be one of the recommendations that we passed along with this is that the sideboard is that there's a sunset. Also, the other sideboard on all of these for me is it goes to a vote of the people. And while I got the mic, I would just add to Bill's point, we are very lucky. I keep telling people, you got to come back to Salem in 20 or 30 years. We are paying right now for a lot of sins that were made in the past where our business community was not as involved with our nonprofits and our churches as they are right now. We are very blessed to have a business community that is saying we are going to help stand in the gap and provide a lot of services to the neediest in our community by willingly donating money to these nonprofits. Liberty House, Family Building Blocks, YMCA, Boys and Girls Club. When you drive down by Rite Aid and you see all the people that are there, that is a result of us not being involved as a business community 20 and 30 years ago. It's going to be an entirely different community because of what's being done right now. We have some very effective nonprofits that are supported almost entirely by our business community. And so I hope everyone thinks about that as they're out choosing where to spend their money, that the more you can support local, the more our local businesses will support our community. Sorry, I'm off my soapbox now.
Levy?
So as the leader of a nonprofit organization that's not supported by businesses, I still support the idea that we need to figure out a way how to sunset this thing as soon as we have. So I would love, to me, I would love to hear this as saying, hey, maybe there will be donations from businesses coming to Mano Mano. I won't be heartbroken if there are not. But I think this, I do support the general idea that we need to figure out, that we need somebody, the city council or somebody, we need to figure this out so that we come up with a way where this small short-term ideas go away. And sorry, this is more of a reaction than anything. Sorry.
Scott?
I'm just going to tag on while the microphone's on. I think from a policy statement that I would like to see in the packet creation, something to emphasize the effectiveness of local nonprofits in tackling the city, not these cities, some of the policy issues experienced within the city, with specific emphasis on the homelessness issue, pointing to some of the effectiveness of our nonprofit partners, perhaps getting higher benefits per dollar versus what the city is expending on the same program.
Sean?
Well, I'd just like to speak to item number 40, urban renewal, increased frozen base. I'd like to see us emphasize this actually as something the city absolutely should do on the short term. It's probably the easiest thing for the city to do legislatively. And it also, as far as short-term things go, there'll be enormous pressure on the city to undo this fairly quickly. And because of that, it's kind of one of those perfect things where they can't undo it until they get some other tax revenue coming in, but they really want to undo it. Whereas some of these other things, I don't know who's going to be in charge 10 years from now, but I question whether once business license fees actually get in there, if they'd ever actually come back out. Honestly, I don't think they would. And I don't think new higher fees for services would come back out. I don't think we put new franchise fees. I don't think those are coming back out just because we get an income tax further down the line. I think we're just going to get more services. So this is something that I think would actually come back out. And I'd like to see us emphasize it for that reason.
If I may, just really quick on that item, it's a permanent change. So once you change that frozen base, you can't change it back.
But you can make new urban renewal districts.
You can, yes, but that specific urban renewal district, you can't change that frozen base back to where it was.
Stephen?
Thank you, Stephen Jenkins. So, as I look at near-term options, medium-term, long-term, I think the key to these different options are not in terms of what's the word I'm trying to think of? So it's a matter of how long it's going to take for revenue to start flowing from those, right? And so my concern was saying we're just going to sunset the near-term options when we get the longer-term options. When I start looking at the longer and medium-term options, those become, the legal viability is more questionable. There's more complexity to them. So there's a lot of other considerations with them. And so I think my concern was saying short-term options, then sunset them, is that maybe the longer-term options, to Raquel's point earlier, maybe those won't come to fruition. And I think it's probably going to be a reasonable mix of both the near-term options, medium-term options, and the longer-term options that get us to where we need to, instead of just saying we only focus on the longer-term options.
All right, I would like to move us on to franchise fees. I believe we also had a robust discussion about those. Are there any other considerations we need to discuss as a group tonight? Bill Smaldone wants to talk, but he didn't raise his hand.
So I'm thinking about near term, medium term, and long term. I think we have to think about what we're talking about. that is near-term implementation or long-term implementation versus near-term revenue and long-term revenue, right? So I noticed, for example, that on the medium-term options, you have the local option property tax levy, for example, and the personal income tax, right? I'm speaking for myself here. So for me, the personal income tax is the long-term solution to the city's revenue problem, right? And the local option property tax is an option for the immediate term, for next year, right? It's for the city to come out next year in May with some kind of local option to carry it through until the long-term solution, which I would see as the income tax, can be implemented, which, according to your chart here, is one of the more complex things to implement.
So just a point of clarification on that timeline. The estimates that we have in that column are the estimate between if it was approved and implemented, how long it would take to start generating revenue. So it doesn't take into account, for example, if it did have to go up for a ballot vote, if it did have to do any of those things. It's once everyone says, yes, we're implementing this, how long it might actually take to start generating that revenue.
Okay.
So that's one point. And then we'll get to this on the medium-term options too, the personal income tax versus long-term, full restructuring too, and sort of the different timelines, potential timelines for those in terms of when that revenue would start coming in.
Stephen, your hand was up.
Actually, just to address my comment.
Great. Okay, higher/new fees for services. So this would be things like permitting fees, fees related to parks and recreation, anything the city's already got in place that is directly related to someone using the fee. Considerations that council needs to know about this. Using the service. Raquel and then Becky.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. I'd like to see fees reinstated at the library for late book returns. Thank you.
Becky?
Becky Beeman, I don't know that the library fees are common, but I don't know if they cost more to administer than they make. I don't want to pay any more to be allowed to remove a tree off my own property now that we have to measure it at chest height and determine how big it is. I'm not sure we want to recommend additional service fees.
Sean?
Yeah, I agree with that, actually, that we shouldn't continue with the higher service fees. For one, I mean, most of these fees we're talking about are really planning fees, housing fees, and we're trying as a state, but also as a city, to develop more housing, and I see those two things as actually competing. And I'm sure a lot of people would actually agree with that. And, I think the parks, to use the parks right now, the current fees are already too high. And I think it stops people from enjoying our parks. So overall, I would be against higher service fees. Is that a motion then to remove item 12?
I move we remove item. TJ and Zach, could you please turn off your mic? Thank you.
I move we remove item 12.
I second.
And we have a second.
What park fees are you talking about?
If you want to have lunch at the park with a group of friends and use one of the covers, you have to pay a fee.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Right.
Yeah, Ray Quisenberry. I tend to agree with that argument. I just wondered how much more money you would generate by raising these fees. Look, at the park, for instance, the fee is really not that high. It's like $35, as I recall. No, maybe more than that. I'm sorry, but it's still not that high. So anyway.
Ray, you're right. It's pretty. We're not gonna solve the city's revenue crisis by feeing ourselves out of it. Especially with user fees. One of the pieces of information that we did receive, though, from the survey in the town halls was people really wanted that connection of who uses the service versus who pays for the service. And this group has talked about that before. We can't do that with police and fire. You can't opt out or pay more when the fire department comes. But there are some things like recreation, for example, that you can charge a user fee. It's much more, the revenue generating side is much more than on the building and permitting side than any of the other fees the city currently has in place. Kathy, and then Scott.
Kathy Knock. So just want to reiterate that building fees are restricted to the building program. The only other part of the permit fees are the ones that are funded from the general fund. And the city's already been working to try to recover the cost. Currently, some of those fees are subsidized by the general fund already, to the point about housing. So some of the places where you could raise it, you may not want to raise it, but the city's already trying to find that balance.
Scott?
I would like to make the suggestion that we keep this line item as it is, but insert a policy note urging city staff or council to consider the affordability and access to the services when possibly instituting new rate or fee increases.
Matt?
Matt Hale, I would concur with what Scott just said. I'd like to keep it with that policy note.
Okay, do you want to amend, Becky? Do you want to amend your motion, or shall we move to a vote on it? Let's move to a vote. Okay, that's fine. The motion is to remove item 12 and to not ask for an increase in any user fees. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. I would have to call for a division of the room.
Yeah, can we do a hand raise on the ayes, please? I have 12. Are we tied?
I'm so sorry. We're going to have to do it again because I had 13.
You're right, 13.
Do we want to remove an option when the vote is that close?
It was 13. Well, that's a
13
matter of
to 11?
policy. I mean,
Okay.
do we?
I believe
do
according to
people feel?
charter, we are just doing majority vote.
The city council will do what it decides it's going to do anyway.
All right, so then let's move on to 40 then, or?
Yeah. Okay, and then the last was urban renewal. So are there any additional comments on that one? Nate?
I apologize. I have a comment on a previous thing. I'll make this very quick, just a policy comment. So it's not on urban renewal, but it just occurred to me, just going back to business license fees. If it would be, I think it would be smart if, so it was pointed out that, restaurants have grease traps. The city of Salem has an important interest in verifying that restaurants are using their grease traps and cleaning them properly, right? So I would just suggest that whatever business licensing fee we might propose, it should be tied to something that the city needs to know or verify about a given business. That is my suggestion. Thank you.
We allowed that deviation just once. That's it for tonight. Actually, I'm not the chair, so. All right, let's move on to the medium-term options then.
Really quickly, it is 7:40 almost. Do we need a break?
What's left on near term? So business license fees, franchise fees, urban renewal are left.
So do we break or do the medium-term options and break? All right, we'll break.
We'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Coming back to order.
All right. Are we called back to order? Great. So we want to talk about medium-term options. We have 4 options on this list. We have the local option property tax levy, the personal income tax, restaurant tax, and the vacancy tax for empty dwellings. A couple of things to point out. We do have an asterisk. This was true in the survey as well as in this packet. The personal income tax we have listed out as this would be the simple version. If all you were doing was putting a personal income tax into place, this could be potentially a medium-term option. If there were, I know there's been quite a bit of discussion about wanting to pair a personal income tax with additional tax restructuring or reform. The tax restructuring and reform we have on the long-term option, and this group could obviously choose to bring those 2 things together to say we want to do personal income tax now and tax restructuring in the future. You could choose to say we only want to do personal income tax if it is paired with that future tax restructuring, in which case it would be more of a longer-term option. So you have a lot of different ways to handle it, but I just wanted to explain some of the reasoning behind why we had split it up that way so that we could also address it in that near, medium, long-term format that you had requested. So I think that's the only other thing I wanted to note. So I think we can go through the same process. First and foremost, are there any on this list that you would like to remove at this point in time before we talk about key considerations? TJ.
Yep, TJ Sullivan, I would like to remove the restaurant tax.
Second.
Who seconded that one? Great.
Any discussion on the removal?
Yep, to the motion.
Ray and then TJ?
Oh, okay. I just wanted to kind of oppose taking it off, frankly. Very Quisenberry, by the way. Of these items we've been looking at tonight, a restaurant tax, in my mind, is the only thing that would capture any income from people that come into the city to work but don't live here. I mean, so when you go to lunch, for instance, you go downtown and you get lunch, so you would actually contribute a little bit of money that you would not have because you don't live in the city, and help with our fire protection and police protection and so forth. And it says here that it's not progressive, and it's true, it's not progressive, but it is for most of us. I would call it disposable income. For people that eat out a lot, and I eat out a lot, so I'm sort of taxing myself here because I live alone. But I would like to leave this on, in my opinion.
TJ?
Yeah, to the motion. Restaurants have been through a lot with COVID, and they're starting to work their way back. And I think that adding one more burden on them with collecting a tax and paying it is not a good idea at this time.
Nathan?
Nate Raffin. I would say that the days of state workers going out to lunch and that being meaningful business for restaurants, those days are gone. Most state workers, well, I shouldn't say most, I don't know that, but more state workers now are working remotely than in the past. And I think if you talk to a lot of restaurant owners who are in and around the core of Salem, they will say that lunch is increasingly not viable business. The other point I would make is that there are a number of people in this community who, for them, going out to eat is not disposable income necessarily, or like a luxury. There are a lot of people who cannot cook for themselves, who maybe don't have that ability, who do need to go out oftentimes for sustenance. And I think even though restaurants can and would pass this tax on to consumers on the bottom of their ticket, I think, to TJ's point, we live in a different world than we did just a few years ago, and I would be concerned that this tax would have a really negative impact on restaurants because of how expensive restaurants have become, and people feeling like with inflation they don't have a lot of money to spend. And this would be another reason why people would stop going to restaurants and want to cook at home. So I would just be concerned about those things.
Any further discussion?
Yeah. Nathan, I think you bring up good points, and I think that could be said for every business in this community. I think you have some darn good points there. I would like you guys to keep that same equity lens open when you go back to the short-term goals here of taxing small businesses in our community. That could be detrimental to them.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of removing item 30, the restaurant tax, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it.
Great. All right. Well, then with our 3 remaining options, starting with the local option. Yeah?
We need to know how many names, please?
Oh, we did not do a count of nays, but we can. We have 4.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. All right. For the local option property tax levy, is there any key considerations, policy considerations that we would want to consider at this time? Becky?
I'd like to consider aiming this exclusively at the library in response to the citizenry gathering and storming with their pitchforks.
Bill?
Well, I agree that the library should be one beneficiary, but the chief spokesman for the library has also been circulating the idea of a local option that would actually tax more than just the library. And so I'm wondering if limiting it to the library is a good idea. In other words, I think we should suggest to the city, when we get around to making the suggestions, we should suggest that the local option be on the table and that they should decide which elements of the general fund would be included within the tax.
And Lee first, and then Scott and Levy.
I'd like us to consider one of the public testimony that we heard was from someone who was talking about a livability levy. And as I was thinking about livability, those are the things that make a city where you want to live and where you want to raise your kids. And that's the library, that's recreation, that's graffiti abatement. It's places, funding places and things to where we want our families to be.
Scott?
Scott Cantonwine. What would be the feasibility of having a local option levy for police or for fire? I know we've talked a lot about the library, but I know police and fire have both pulled very high.
Yes, I think that's the answer, is that police and fire have pulled very high on the community survey. I believe they were number 1 and 2 in terms of services. So I think that is part of the conversation, unless there's anything else.
Good. I guess as a follow-up to my question, then I would like to suggest that we have yet another policy statement encouraging the prioritization of police and fire when local option levy is suggested.
Kathy?
Kathy Knock, I have a question. I think it's for Josh. But it seems to me like at the beginning, we talked about that the library, to keep the library open, is about $10 million. And so the levy is actually, if we limited it to that, we're going to have a lot of money we can't spend. Am I remembering this wrong?
The library budget is approximately $6 million.
$6 million. So the levy could raise more than that.
Yes, absolutely.
Levy?
So I actually love the idea of the livability levy. I think definitely the public safety pulls very high, and so I would really want to give that idea of the livability tax to council as an option. It could be alongside, another option is public safety, that they could look at that. Because usually, since public safety pulls so high, things like the library, like other things that improve livability are often easier to cut. And then we're ending up with a lot more social issues that then will have to be addressed by public safety. So it becomes like vicious cycle.
Becky?
I noticed that this is green on the sustainable revenue, but our current property tax is not sustainable on a continuing basis. Why is this one sustainable? I mean, it seems to me like we would run out of money. I mean, if we spent all the money that we got that first year, the second year it seems like we'd be short money because whatever we were paying for would cost more and we can't get any more money.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I didn't develop this criteria, so I'm not sure about it. But speaking specifically to a couple of the challenges with the local option levy is you're right. It has the same constraints plus a couple more as our current property tax system. So you'd want to make sure that whatever rate you set it at was sufficient to cover you for that 5-year period. So it might be more than you need in year 1 and a little bit less than you need in year 5 to cover the costs for what you're actually targeting. And then for the other challenges that you have to renew it, and you guys all know that. So every 5 years you have to go and renew a local option levy.
Yeah, I would just jump in here. So what Josh said about setting it at the rate that would recover over the 5-year period, what we can forecast. The other piece is that it does require a approval every 5 years. So on that 5-year renewal, it would be, does it need to be structured differently? And do we look at what is covered under it, right? That's up to then the next council ultimately.
Right.
Bill?
So to be clear, it's the current property tax rate that is insufficient to fund the city's needs going forward. The local option would be sort of on top of that, right? It's in addition to that, right? And if we were to do a livability levy, then when I think of livability, I think of the library, I think of the parks, right? I think of the Center 50 Plus, as I think Levy noted. These are things that the city tends to cut earliest because of the focus on public safety. So that, again, would be a question for the council to make a decision on where that would go. And I don't know if we, aside from saying that they would have the option, should be making a specific recommendation.
Anything else on this topic? Okay. Well, then let's move forward to the personal income tax. And I think that this is a conversation, as I mentioned before, about sort of, do we want to move this forward as a simple personal income tax that is put into place, or in combination with that longer term tax restructuring as well? But any considerations, thoughts on that one? Becky.
I think we ought to make it plain that we see this as an option for the main leg of funding the city, which allows them to be more equitable in their other revenue sources. I don't think we can make them go progressive-er, but we can suggest that that's what the community wants based on our revenue surveys.
Russ?
Yeah, Russ Beaton. I'd like to review where we were last meeting, and that the task force voted to require me to meet with the city revenue officer and hash it out, talk about options, which we did. And to Josh's credit, he had already asked me to meet, so that wasn't a tough one to meet. And we had a very good meeting and went over the methodology in detail that would water your eyes, so I'm not even going to go through that. But did agree that that the methodology we're using is probably as good as we can do right now, and talked about practical issues of going forward with that with the Department of Revenue, et cetera. But the request from the task force was to create some scenarios so that we could examine those. Now, they were circulated, and I have copies of them, of the summaries of our scenarios. If you have interest in that, you don't have a hard copy. We came up with 4 scenarios, and they ranged from option 1 that raises an estimated tax of $25.9 million to option 4 that raises $73.7 million. These are projected numbers as of the 2021 income tax data. So currently, we could probably expect more from that if it all could be collected. I would call your attention as you examine them to 3 variables that really are important. One is the absolute level of rates. How high are they? Like ranging from 0.25% on up. 2, the level or the threshold at which a tax structure below which would be exempt. And clearly, as opposed to the way the payroll tax did it, everyone would be exempt under that level, even if you make $1 million a year. You wouldn't pay any taxes from 0 to whatever. And then the third variable is the progressivity of the structure, how fast the rates go up as your income goes up. And as many have said here, progressivity is most easily built into this type of a tax. There are very few others that we've considered that that can be manipulated to be progressive. The 4 scenarios, and I think this speaks to your concern about how they integrate with revenue reform. Obviously, it would be the case that a low level of income taxes would fix the budget, perhaps, ongoing, but it wouldn't allow the funding to do revenue reform. So the higher the choice would be made, the more that revenue reform could be accomplished. So I think that's how that situation would work out. So now, where we would be with regard to these revenues scenarios, it would be my assumption, I think we've gone this way already as a task force, that we're not picking one of these and saying, hey, city, institute this tax structure. We are saying, as these say to you, these are a range of options to be considered, and it's this range of options that we would pass on to the council, certainly not saying X dollars should be raised. So there we are, and again, as you consider them, as you go 1 to 4, 4 is more progressive, higher rates as well, of course, but more progressive than 1, and it would be a choice as to where to cut it off at the end. I'd like to say one more thing. Now, that's me as a scribe reporting back what we chose, what we were asked to do. I'll now put on the hat of favoring a personal income tax, and I look at our midterm options. The yellow cell on here under impact on local economy. It says yes, likely low. I'd like to point out here again, as an economist, a very progressive income tax. You have to ask where the money's coming from, where the money's going to, what is the effect on multipliers, and there's all kinds of complicated stuff that for estimating economic impact in that regard. If you tax someone that has very high income, you do not affect their lifestyle. Largely, the money would come from savings or selling some stock or, renting out your Black Butte house for a week or something like that. And that money is passive in the economy right now. It's not active in the economy. And therefore, an income tax would bring that money into the economy to be regenerated and multiplied by people who have to spend most of it. In that regard, an income tax, and the more progressive it is, the more this is true. An income tax has the exact financial impact as attracting a new business to the city. And when I last looked, I've been involved in business attraction for a lot of years now. That's the holy grail of economic development, is attracting a new business to town. So if we pass an income tax, or if the city does an income tax, you get an economic incentive plan at the same time you fix the city's revenue problems. And what's not to like? Thank you. Questions?
Ken had a question, then I saw Nate and Becky.
So Russ, just trying to understand, so we're talking about midterm versus long-term. Where do you see your proposal fitting in those two? And I'll just preface that with
As
my
she was
experience
saying, the long-term is the tax itself, or the medium-term tax itself. The long-term is the effect it would have on revenue reform. Should you raise more money than you need, then I think it would be incumbent on this group to put in and to make as many suggestions as possible. I know Scott agrees with that very much, that should you end up raising more money than you need to do the budget, you need to be committed to what other revenue sources, operations fees, franchise fees, whatever seems to be probably the most regressive, that we would recommend to the council that they eliminate first. Because tax reform is nothing more than substituting one form of taxation for another.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I ask that is because in my experience, short-term and medium-term turn into long-term. So I would be concerned we hit a medium-term goal with the idea of it's going to turn into long-term, and that never happens. And so do we actually accomplish what we're looking for?
The variable here, of course, is the council would have to choose on a service level, and then the higher the service level, the less the revenue reform, and et cetera. We all know that.
Nate?
I withdraw mine.
Okay. Becky, Matt?
Becky Beeman, I would recommend that we also include the numbers, Russ, from when you met with the chamber members who are also on the Revenue Task Force, so that the council can see what the estimates were on the average of the recommendations from those few people.
That's a good point, Becky, and I would say that option 2 on here was purposely tailored to be very close to that, even though we evened the numbers out, because the numbers that those people came up with were an average, and so they were kind of weird, but we evened them out to make very, very similar. Notice that option 2 is $43.2 million, and I believe that's almost exactly the one that I presented last time.
But I don't think the chamber recommended 0 for the first bracket.
That is true.
So that might be worth showing.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt, your hand was up, and then Stephen, and then TJ.
Russ, 2 questions here. How do we sell to the council this 37% community support? And 2, do you have an example of another similar size city here in the country that has something like this, that also has high property taxes and high state income taxes as well?
Well, I have made some calls to cities in the east that do this, and things are all over the map. I do know that in Indiana, every county has an income tax. And there are all kinds of patterns all over the nation. But I haven't, it's be a difficult job to compare it with, property taxes as well in that particular area. But in answer to your question, I think some of that should go on, but it hasn't, not much yet.
And what about the 37% community?
Right. I believe that figure goes back to what Bill Smaldone was talking about earlier, and that the material that the public was given made the personal income tax and the payroll tax almost the same, and we know what this community thinks about a payroll tax. They've told us. So I think the degree of differentiation there wasn't enough to make really that a reasonable piece of data that we got from the community. I don't criticize folks for coming and giving their opinion, but it depends on what they're assuming. Bill, is that accurate?
That's correct. I mean, it was basically listed without explaining that it would be progressive, that the option would be progressive. if you introduce an income tax that's flat, then you might as well have a payroll tax.
That's right.
I had Stephen, TJ, Scott, Becky.
Thank you, Stephen Jenkins. So just a couple of numbers to think about as we think through this. So 150% of federal poverty level in Salem is about $45,000 a year. And so I'm concerned about having any level of taxation for somebody who's only at 150% of federal poverty level. And 150% sounds like a lot until you realize how the federal poverty level is actually calculated is problematic, just to say that. The median income, household income in the city of Salem is right about $70,000, between $67,000 and $70,000, based on the sources that I could find. So on a lot of these, roughly half the households in Salem would not pay anything. I think the other piece that's important, though, is to think about what we think about as being wealthy. And one number we can use is what kind of income would be required to purchase a home, a median price home in the city of Salem right now. And right now it's about $120,000 for household income to buy a median price home in the city of Salem. So, while I think it's important, and I think this is an important element of revenue, I think I want to be really thoughtful about how we put it forward in terms of both at the lower level and as well as we think about the higher levels. $120,000 sounds like a lot of money until you realize that that's what it takes to buy a median price home in the city of Salem.
TJ?
Yeah, I just want to state that TJ Sullivan, the goal of this task force, our charge was to come up with, alternative revenue options, and as opposed to what we do right now. I believe measures 5, 47, and 50, based on what we've heard in this room, that it's people having more property taxes would be detrimental to the overall financial health of their household. 547 and 50 has saved a lot of households that threat at the expense of the city. So we are charged with coming up with an alternative revenue option, and this is, I think, an interesting option too that we would consider. And but I also think that we need to pay attention to the law of unintended consequences. You're not going to rent out your house in Black Butte and cover the cost of this tax, but you are going to go and live there 4 days a week so that you can establish residency, and you'll remote work from your house in Black Butte, and you'll spend 3 days a week in Salem, and you'll avoid paying this tax. So, I think that as you pay, the law of unintended consequences could be that the people that we're expecting to shoulder a large share of the burden of this are going to easily avoid it and not pay it.
Scott?
I would wholeheartedly, Scott Cantonwine, I would wholeheartedly echo TJ's comments on the laws of unintended consequences. I had just a couple questions to follow up for you, Russ. First, let me jump over to Matthew's question about similar sized jurisdictions with similar property tax structures. I would point to to Metro. With their 1% supportive homeless services tax that's levied. I may butcher these numbers. 1% over 125,000 is a single filer, and I believe it's 1% over either 200 or 250,000 is a household filer. Which is a segue to my question for you, Russ. Are these figures modeled on the number of tax returns within these income brackets? So it's capturing a single filer, then maybe a married filing jointly, or is it based on census figures within those brackets?
The data is simply tax returns, and have no way of knowing whether it's a single filer or a family or anything else, but it is keyed to an address. And one of the questions Josh and I discussed is, You might have a Salem address and be outside the city limits. I was there for years and on my farm, and yet I was 8 miles east of town. I was in 97301 zip code. You know. So there is a lot of grubby work to do to figure out exactly how you can do that. And the question again that we and Josh talked about. Is it possible to hit an income tax on people who work in Salem as opposed to just live in Salem? And there are legal questions and jurisdictional questions to look at to determine all that. We're not in position to do that. I don't think it's a task force, and that would be part of the staff process as the thing is implemented over the next year or so, whenever it would be.
Thank you.
Becky and then Bill S.
Becky Beeman. With regard to the 36% community approval, I think that if we showed people the lower income that was going to be excluded, that if the council shows exclusions of the lower income levels that go further than what the wage tax was going to go, I think that'll go toward reducing the resistance to this.
Bill? And then Kathy?
In response to my friend TJ's very low level of expectations of our fellow citizens, who he thinks would move to Black Butte to avoid paying their tax, I like to think of more positive examples. I like to think of people, for example, one of my heroes perhaps, Warren Buffett, right, who once urged, right, that he be taxed more heavily, right, because of his great wealth. So perhaps we have some citizens in our city who are also waiting to be taxed more heavily to help their fellow citizens out. We should consider not just the good, but also, not just the bad, but also the good.
Could you find us a Warren Buffett? I believe Raquel said, can you find us a Warren Buffett? You want that on the record? Kathy?
Kathy Knock, we've spent a lot of time the last 3 meetings talking about the personal income tax and all of the different options, and there's clearly too many options, even for, I think, for council to get done without a couple of work sessions. Since we're tasked with making recommendations, I'm wondering how people are feeling about putting this forward as a recommendation with a policy note that says we think that the council should consider a tax reform task force that would delve further into long-term or even medium-term revenue solutions and how we could develop a tax philosophy as a city, right? How it would affect fees, how it would affect the budgeting process. Because I don't see us as a group in 4 hours being able to hash out, dedicating it, which scenario, what options we want to highlight. But I think what I'm hearing is we all agree this is an interesting idea. It has interesting possibilities that are going to need a lot more public input because we can sit here and say, oh, we don't think that 36% is right, but there are members of the community who are like, yeah, I don't support it, right? Like, we don't actually know. We need to have some better data. There needs to be a lot more work that is done and done in a public setting for this to be fleshed out, come to fruition. And I'm just wondering if we can feel comfortable recommending to the council, we think this is a good idea, but it needs to be fleshed out, and you should figure out a way to flesh it out in a public setting, whether it's work sessions for council, whether it's another task force. What I think they're looking for, to what TJ said, is they're looking for ideas, and ideas that have hope. Well, we've said we think this has hope. It depends on how you do it. So let's tell them that, put it on the list, and see how we can raise money in the short term to keep our services so there's something to fund in the long term.
Levy?
Yeah, Levy Lopez. I was going to support what Stephen was mentioning about the different income levels. It does, and I think that also matters, like the perception of people, because I know the families that I serve and that I work with, if they see it in their ballot that they're likely going to be taxed, they're definitely not going to support it. So if they see that there's more variety and more diversity, I think they will be more likely to support it. And I don't see that as them saying, oh, well, we're putting it off on somebody. It's a reaction that, oh, I'm only making $40,000, and taxing me on my income is going to put me in hardship in ways that other folks are not going to be. And so having that something more progressive I think is more, it would have would be more receptive to a lot of people, or people would be more receptive to it, sorry. So to that, and I think I do like the idea of having some kind of recommendation that they actually start looking into this. So.
Great. Okay, so I think we've captured a lot of good potential considerations for this option. I would like, in the interest of time, to move us forward to the last item that we have on here as well, which is the vacancy tax for the empty dwelling fees. One thing I will note for your consideration is that we don't actually have a revenue estimate for this, because we're not able as the city to actually gather information about, for example, how many dwellings are currently vacant within the city. That's one of the reasons why this is an administratively complex topic. So I know we shared a lot more in the packet with you on this, but anything else that we want to talk about on that vacancy tax? TJ and then Sean.
I guess I'll bring up the law of unintended consequences again. We as a state are concerned about the cost of homes, and we're trying to bring down the cost of homes so more people can have a place to live. And so as such, we are incentivizing builders to get out and build as much as possible so that hopefully the cost will come down. And if you do that and people can't get the loans for a variety of reasons, those builders are going to be sitting on houses that they were asked to build to help the community out, and they're going to be paying a vacancy tax on that, which that doesn't seem right to me that we would do that. I mean, I get it if somebody's out there building wild spec homes and they aren't selling and they're just vacant and becoming eyesores. Yes, that person should, but there's no way to put that into the policy process. So I just think we need to be thinking about, okay, we're worried about the affordability of homes and housing. Do we want to add something to it that's going to increase potentially that cost?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The point of vacancy taxes is generally not to penalize brand new construction that's awaiting sale. However, it is fairly well known, especially here in Salem, is that these vacant homes that are left vacant for a while become criminal enterprises and get full of vagrants. People kick in the door and they take over the house. It's not that unusual. And if you go to the meetings around the city, there's always homeowners talking about that as being an issue for their area. And that's the type of thing a vacancy tax can be very aggressive about. A vacancy tax can also be used in a different kind of way to kind of push commercial real estate owners towards closer to being a highest and best use of their current commercial properties. And we do see that as an issue here in Salem sometimes where we have poorly rented spaces or spaces that keep going in and out of being rented. And even in our downtown, it can be a difficulty when there are actually good tenants out there. They're just having trouble with negotiations. So those are two, I think, really solid reasons to have a vacancy tax. And a vacancy tax, when we're talking about homes that have been taken over by other people who are not the owners, who are aggressive about it, it can have real purposes and actually cost a lot. It could cost somebody a lot for that reason, because we need to push people to deal with these kinds of problems.
Jean, did I see your hand up? No. Okay. Did you have your hand up? Great. All right.
Jean, could you turn your mic on?
Jean Palmetier. The vacancy tax and the, where was the other one? Where we have fee increases. seems to me that those two things could overlap at some level. Because in my neighborhood, when we hear about this vacancy issue, it has to do with the number of times the police come to visit, how many times the fire engines are showing up, how many times the ambulances come. And so a lot of that has to do with poor decision-making on the people who are residing in these places, or the mess they make in the backyard, or whatever else is going on here. So, and to me, part of the issue about vacancy is what constitutes a vacancy, how long is it, and what happens to that house in the interim while it's vacant. So, those being said, I generally support the idea of the vacancy tax, but I'm not sure how you do it. I mean, how would you even know until somebody shows up? End of subject.
I think TJ and then Scott.
Yeah, as Sean said something that made me think about, I guess a sidebar would be that from the date of completion of a house, that the vacancy tax can't be implemented for 2 years following, I don't know, the permit that gets pulled or whatever, when they certify a house could be as livable. Occupancy. That there should be a delay so that we're not, for people who are out building new homes, that they're not getting hit with this tax. Because typically they are checking on them. They have an incentive to try and sell them, so they got realtors stopping by. They're not typically adding to the problem of squatters moving in and becoming a nuisance in the neighborhood.
Scott?
Scott Canton one. I think my takeaway from the conversation on this topic is there's a lot of confusion over what would constitute vacancy. But one of the common themes I'm hearing are issues like squatters or vacant homes that are sites of unruly criminal behavior, which maybe makes me think that perhaps if the goal is to reduce vacancy and drive towards highest and best use, maybe that's something that can be done through an ordinance process with a fine, and we don't have to look at it through a tax. And to that point, I'm sure there are probably already items in city code that maybe address that, so maybe this needs to be an enforcement priority instead of a new tax.
I saw Bill. We're doing dueling microphones here. I think it was Bill and then Becky?
I think Raquel.
And Raquel,
also.
great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Raquel also.
Great.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. I just want to make a comment about squatters, okay? The laws to remove them are so difficult. So to put the onus on the owner of a property, penalizing them for, their property having been taken over, that just doesn't sit well in my book. So I kind of like what Jean said is, this is a fee. Should it be rolled into the other fees and considered with constraints around it? So just my comment. Thank you.
Bill?
Bill Smaldone. So I don't know how much this would bring in for the city, and as a revenue item, it's probably pretty minor. But it seems to me also there's a degree of symbolism here. So I live down the street from the navigation center, and a lot of people go by my house on their way there. At the same time, in my neighborhood, there are several houses that have been empty for, I would say, 2 to 3 years. They just sit. So somehow, there's a huge contradiction there. I also know that you don't always make a direct connection between the people who are living in the street and then their occupation of a house. There might be more steps between getting them off the street into those houses. But at the same time, there are many people who are fully capable of paying rent and moving into a new rental and cannot find the rentals they need because the houses are off the market, right? And so this might work to bring them back into the market.
Becky Beeman, I have concerns in a completely personal end. The house I bought when I finally bought in Salem, had been vacant for 2 years. They were trying to find the price point. I don't know at what point the vacancy tax comes in. It was shown actively. There was lots going on, but nobody got it. When my parents moved into assisted living, they kept the house because Mom was pretty sure they'd move, Dad would die, and she'd move back. I don't know at what point you start taxing that as a vacant dwelling. There are so many details to be worked out before I could decide whether I like it or not.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Kathy Knock. To Becky's point, my mom also was in a rehab facility for 14 months. Therefore, her house was vacant, and so not sure exactly what would have happened. And then as a point to some of the squatter houses and the vagrant houses, code enforcement does in fact impose fines on a lot of these places. And when those fines get to be $100,000, $200,000, and there's property taxes that have been in arrears for 4 or 5 years, that becomes a detriment in selling the house. So where is this tax going to fit into all of those overdue fines? That if you want to bring those back into use, sometimes we have to forgive those fines. So I don't really see this as a revenue issue. I think that we may need to address in general how we handle that, but and especially because to me, where this would apply, and I haven't heard anyone say it, is like, how long does an apartment stay vacant, right? If you have a brand new apartment complex, they met whatever the affordable housing requirement was, but they have an entire floor of $2,500 a month apartments that they're not renting because everybody wants the $1,800 a month apartment. Can you structure a tax to do that? Is it 30 days, 60 days, a year? Like there's a lot of complexity in this. And I think even in a medium-term option, the council and the community would be better served looking at other options. So I appreciate that, the discussion, but I would not support continuing with this.
Scott and Stephen?
I would like to make a motion to remove line 41 from the medium-term options.
Okay, any discussion to the motion?
That was TJ seconding first, I believe. Stephen?
Well, I guess I'll speak to the motion then. And I would agree in removing it. I think this is an important tool in addressing the housing issue in the city of Salem and state of Oregon in general. I don't know that it's an important tool in solving our revenue issues. So I think the city should still look at something like this, just not for this purpose.
Any further comments? Sorry.
Levi Herrera Lopez. Yeah, one of the bigger issues with people finding housing, even when homes or apartments are available, is the cost itself, and so that would be, I think that would complicate situation, as Kathy was mentioning. There's also the issue of blight when it comes to commercial buildings, and I see that a lot on Lancaster Drive, but that may be better handled in different ways other than text.
Kate Strathy, I agree with taking it off the table, so I agree. But one thing that no one has said is, when I read this, I wasn't thinking of charging individuals or people who are out of their house for a short period of time. I was thinking of banks. Like if a house is foreclosed upon in our neighborhood, I'm Jean's neighbor, but in our neighborhood we have 3 houses that are empty, and I've lived there for 3.5 years, and one has been empty the entire time I've lived there. It's sinking into the ground and dilapidating. All 3 of them are, and that's on Capitol. And so, like, why? Who owns them, and why are they sinking into the ground? I believe it's banks. So in that case, yeah, the bank should pay. So I would think, why have they not put it back on the market? Why have they not put it in auction? And why is our community just disintegrating? And so, yeah, it's a bigger conversation. I'm okay with taking it off, but I don't think we were targeting individuals. I think it was more like those larger companies. But
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor of removing item 41, vacancy tax, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. The ayes have it.
Fantastic. All right, well then we can turn to our longer term options here. Colleen, do you want to walk us through?
All right, I'm ready. Very excited about this slide. So these are our long-term options. We have 6. First question is, are there any motions to remove any of these items from the list? Jean. Jean, you need to turn your mic on. I'm sorry.
I did it again. Jean Palmatier. I would move to remove line 15.
seconded.
Kate seconded.
Okay, any discussion on the marijuana tax increase, number 15?
Jean, would you explain why?
Marijuana is already taxed quite high, and the business is going into the toilet due to other factors, overproduction and whatnot. And it seems to me it's sort of kicking a business while they're down, but that's just me.
Any further discussion? Ray?
Yeah, Ray Quisenberry. It says here it would require a change in state law. So it seems like it would be more work than it's worth, I guess is my thoughts.
That's correct. So we have discussed, I think maybe at one of our early meetings, that the way marijuana taxes are levied is driven by state law. So this would ultimately end up in that policy memo to council saying, when you are lobbying at the state, we lobby for a greater local share of marijuana taxes. But that's about all that you could do with this recommendation.
Yeah, Bill Rickey. Gene, I think to your point about kicking a business when it's down is a good point. I think the marijuana industry in the state is struggling. But I believe that could be said for every business in this community is getting kicked when it's down with anything that's imposed on them. I agree with you 100%. This isn't a striving community. I know that Keith Stay, their city manager, is concerned about the business climate, has reached out to other small business owners within this community, asking them, what is the business climate? So I think it's felt at all levels within our community. And Gene, I think you bring up a very good point. I would just ask again, to use that same equity lens when looking at imposing things on other businesses as you move forward here.
Ken?
Just real quick comment. I agree with you, Gene. And other than other businesses, there's the black market that is a huge problem driving the marijuana industry. And so increasing the taxes on the stores is just going to push people away from legal marijuana into the alleys. So.
Any further discussion? Well, I would note that marijuana use now exceeds alcohol use in the United States, so maybe someday this will be more profitable. I don't know. All in favor of removing number 15, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. I heard a nay.
One.
Nay. The ayes have it.
All right. Any other options folks want to remove? Yeah, Zach.
Zach Ostertag, I had a question about number 21, payment in lieu of taxes for state government. I'm wondering why the administrative complexity is marked as high.
Ultimately, it's out of the city's hands. So the city can do a certain amount in terms of lobbying, but it's up to the state what they want to do.
But that's not considering, say whatever's out of their hands happen. That's not speaking to anything about receiving the funds or anything like that.
No, I mean, if the state were to write a check, the city would deposit it. Yeah. Speaking on behalf of staff, yeah. It's my assumption. Bill.
Bill Smaldone, can you remind us, please, for number 42, what would non-state government entities be?
So other governmental entities like the county, the school district, although they are also in a difficult budget situation, so maybe not a good time to ask them. Not-for-profit entities, so that would be, if large not-for-profit hospitals, for example, are sometimes engage in this. Universities, things like that.
Churches?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sean?
Well, the one I'd like to remove is special district formation, which, if I could speak to it, I see as counterproductive to putting more money in the general fund.
So moved. Is there a second?
Oh, a second, okay. So does anyone want to speak to special district formation?
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. I have a question, Sean. So if a special district is formed, so you've got money that goes specifically to the service area there, taking care of it, and let's say it's just library, okay? So then so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so we've got a special district for this, and we've got money coming in, it will cover the expenses. So those expenses are no longer part of the general fund. So that money is then released up into the general fund for other purposes. So in my mind, if I understand it correctly, it doesn't take money out of the general fund. If anything, it puts money back in because now this particular item is funded. Is that understanding correct?
I would agree with that. I would just note that the special district formation would entail a property tax, and that property tax would go to the base of the property taxes. It would basically take property taxes away from the city to create the special district when you created it. So it would actually, yeah. If we were to form a special district with something like a new sales tax, not saying we should, but if we did, that would be a different kind of thing. But yeah, this goes to the same tax base.
If I may, just a couple of things related to this. So a couple things happen when you form a special district. So they would be voted, there would be a vote for a new permanent rate for that district. It's been done several different ways across the state, and there's not really a right or wrong way to do it. Sometimes with that vote, it requires the local government to give up a portion of their permanent rate to give to that district. That would be a net zero, right? There's no benefit of that. In other cases, they can have a separate permanent rate, which is what you were just discussing. It could save the city those general fund dollars moving over that special district. Where it does catch up is with compression. So you add another taxing district in an already compressed environment. It's not dollar for dollar. So there is some benefit to the general fund by offloading a service like that. But there is a compression component where everyone on the general government side would lose some property taxes.
Becky?
Before you go away, what's the substantive difference between a special district and the property tax district that we talked about earlier?
So the property tax levy?
Local option.
So a local option levy is temporary. It's for 5 years. It's also gets compressed first, so it's not competing with permanent rates like a new special district would. Once you have a permanent rate, a new special district, it's there, it's permanent. So that's the big difference, is the temporary versus a permanent. And a special district would be a whole separate governance structure. So it wouldn't be the city council, it would be a different governing board. So it's not a local option levy. You could have it on the ballot, it gets voted. We literally add the number to a form when we send it to the county, and that's how simple that process is. A special district is much more complex.
Any further discussion?
It sounds like maybe we ought to keep it just because it's different, and it would be to some extent out of City Council's hands.
Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Do you mind repeating the motion, please?
What the motion is? Yes. Oh, yeah, the motion is to remove special districts formations. Item number 35. Okay, we'll start over with the vote then. So all in favor of removing item number 35, special district formation, say aye. 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 All against, say nay. Nay. Yeah, definitely have the division room on that one.
Can we do an ayes hand? That would be 14, so the motion passes. Okay, shall we get into talking about considerations for payments in lieu of taxes? We can start with the state. TJ doesn't want to talk about it? Yep, okay. And anything for the non-state government entities, any considerations we want to add there? Becky?
If we're talking about going after churches, we need to be cognizant of what they typically have as budgets, which is failing every year. So.
Kathy?
I'm also not interested in going after the county and the school district when they're all struggling with money. I mean, I don't want to be painted with the picture of us not educating our children to fund the library. That seems like not a good thing.
Bill?
I move that we strike this from the list.
Okay, motion to strike number 42, payment in lieu of taxes from the list. Any discussion on that?
Scott?
Just a question of clarification. Would removing this line prevent us from seeking any payment in lieu of taxes from the federal government?
Yes, I believe as it was structured, that federal government was included in that line.
Okay, thank you.
I saw Raquel's hand and TJ's hand.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. You know, here again, I think it's something that can be tailored. If we don't want to do churches, then we just put that policy note into it, you know. But I do think that it is worth the exploration and the recommendation. I think, especially on this list, which are items that we perceive as maybe having long-term viability, and they will take some effort. But I would encourage us to leave these on, and thank you.
TJ, and then Lee.
Yeah, I was going to jokingly make a friendly amendment to add universities in as a potential for taxation.
You want to add them to what?
Add them to the list of.
Let's not do churches, let's not do universities.
Well, I wasn't going to do that because that would not be ethical for me to do that. But if you want to do that.
To take out, to target universities?
To take out my employer off the list.
Oh. No, I would say we specifically add your employer.
Well, they're already in. They're in. I mean, they're a non-state entity.
So if we remove 42, it'll
If we remove
take
42, my university's off the hook.
Right.
Right. But if we remove 42, then so are all the nonprofits in the city off the hook. And to come back to your point from before, about the importance of all the volunteer efforts being made in the city. The nonprofit sector does an enormous amount of the heavy lifting in this town, where the city can't do any lifting, or only a moderate amount of lifting. So I think we should look away from the nonprofits. I don't think we should look for our money from other governments that are also short of money. So to me, this doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I agree. I second it.
Well, I mean, I would just say that it's kind of unusual to discuss things like nonprofits and things in the payment in lieu of taxes. Like for instance, 911 Center is run by the city of Salem, but the taxes come from various government agencies. Those are payments in lieu of taxes. We're going to have our own ambulance service here in Salem, run with Salem firefighters. Those firefighters are going to leave the city of Salem and take people in their ambulance who are from outside the city of Salem. And I'm sure the county will pay a fee to the city of Salem for that, which is also another payment in lieu of taxes. So there's broader things here than. And I think we've kind of gotten into something that is highly unlikely that we're going to charge churches, the hospital, or nonprofits, which is, generally speaking, not done. So, right? Anyway, that's just my statement on it.
One point of clarification, I believe that when this topic came up in this group, I believe county and federal government were the primary topics of conversation under that area.
Scott and then Stephen.
I would just say I think there is more value to keeping this option on the menu than we gain by taking it off the menu. We don't have to order it, but we should keep it on the menu.
Stephen?
Thank you. Stephen Jenkins. As I'm reading this, it says that requires agreement from the external parties. I don't know if this is something that the city can impose. It would be, we could ask these folks if they want to contribute some money, right? Is that my understanding? Am I understanding that correctly? Okay, so I don't think there's anything wrong with asking people if they want to contribute money to the city. I mean, I don't, they can say no, right? There's no requirement here, so I don't know what the harm then is in leaving it on, since it's simply a request and not a demand.
Any further comments?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're doing conflict of interest or anything like that, but like as I mentioned, I'm the executive director of a local nonprofit, so depending on how the conversation goes, it would. So I don't want to get involved in this one in shaping this. So.
Okay. Any further discussion? All right. All in favor, say aye. Of what? Oh, to remove payment in lieu of taxes, item 42, from discussion, from being suggested to the city council. All in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Nay. The nays have it.
We do need a show of hands just for the count. Could we do the ayes? Four. Okay, thank you. I just picked the minority because it was easier to count, not because we wanted to sell you guys out. Okay, we're on to intergovernmental agreements and entities. This is very wide-ranging. There are a lot of possibilities for an intergovernmental entity or agreement, which is why there's a lot of, well, maybe here. So any considerations do you think are important for council here?
Becky Beeman, everybody who's funded by property tax is hurting, so talking to them isn't going to help.
Moving on to item 44, tax reform and restructuring. We already had quite a bit of discussion about this. Kathy?
Kathy Knock, as far as, I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier, I would like to have a policy note on this that we're recommending that they have work sessions or a task force to look at this more in depth.
Y'all are tired about talking about, oh, no, TJ's not tired about it yet.
I just got my second wind. I would just add that on the in support of the income tax as an alternative strategy, that it was done from my vantage point that we would look at removing a lot of other taxes and fees that are charged by the city. So I think it's a quid pro quo. If we're going to recommend that, then this has to be attached to that in some way.
Bill?
I couldn't agree more. I think that moves us toward tax reform. I think Kathy's suggestions about the city organizing work sessions and perhaps even recruiting another task force to look specifically at this item is a good idea. I also think politically, right, when the city goes to sell an income tax to the population, its ability to give something back will be key, right? And if you can convince the voters that they're really serious about turning around the regressivity of our city finance structure, then it has a greater chance of passing. That's a political question for the council to determine, but the tax reform element would be an important part of that pitch.
Bill, the gates of hell are frozen shut. You and I have voted twice together now.
Every week it gets worse.
If we've got Bill and TJ agreeing, I think we're ready to adjourn.
That was a motion.
All right. So we have 4 options left on this list then: payments in lieu of taxes, intergovernmental agreements, and tax reform. Scott?
I would like to make a motion to include all 4 of those on task force recommendations to the city council.
Okay, there's too many of them.
I should have used that excuse. I just didn't hit it to start with. My motion was to include the remaining 4 items on the task force recommendation to city council.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. The other 4 shall be included. And I don't see any other business before us.
Just a couple.
So very quickly, we wanted to share out the survey results. We did ask you about the prioritization of services. And so we have here listed the results that came back from the last group. So what we could do with this information is basically turn this into a statement. This would be one of those overarching considerations that could be included to say, if council chooses to restrict funding, these are some of the top priorities that this group would like to put forward. So we'll put together a draft of that. So we just wanted to highlight that for you all, and that will be part of what you'll be reviewing between this meeting and next. And with that, I think you will please look out for the survey that will be coming from us with a lot of the summation of this great conversation tonight. And I think I can hand it back over to Chair to close us out.
We are adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. Great work tonight.